Hey everybody, this is Perch. I did a video, Are comics better or worse today? And the general consensus from that video, what I said was they're not as good as they were 20 years ago. They are better than they were 5 to 10 years ago. But it's very subjective. And one of the things I mentioned in my video was that there were a bunch of different criteria in which you could judge a comic book from, and this letter writer actually brings up a very different point that is another criteria to judge comics. And so I'm going to throw it out to you, but I think this is a really interesting topic. This is not as exciting as do they talk politics or how woke they are, but it is to me much more fascinating, quite frankly, as a topic. So let's get into it. It says, "Howdy, Perch. I saw your recent video discussing if comics were better or worse than the day they were in decades past. While it's an interesting debate, I do think that today's books are definitely better in one sense. The exposition is scaled down, allowing the artist to handle the what while the writer handles the why. So many of my back issues from the 70s and 80s have labored narrative boxes describing the action that I'm already seeing in the panel. Not sure the play by play was necessary. Today's writers don't usually bog you down with that. Plus, they've also switched from a third-person narration to a first-person narration, which I think is better for character development because you get to see the characters' motivations in their own words. What do you think, Perch? Do you agree that these changes are better for storytelling, or am I just lazy and don't want to read that much?" I don't think you're lazy, but it's an interesting point. And so to properly kind of convey this, go take a look at some old comics, in particular little dialogue boxes or the little thought bubbles, and compare them to comics today. Now, comics today have a lot fewer dialogue boxes, with one glaring exception, by the way, which we'll get to in a second, and a lot less to zero thought bubbles. Um, for me, the as I said, I think comics were better, but I won't deny the way that the storytelling currently takes place. More of like the letter writer said, more of trusting the artist to actually show you what's going on rather than being told. I agree that's better when you have a good artist and when the artist is given enough time. But those are two pretty big buts. And generally speaking, the artist isn't given enough time and isn't given enough information. And some cases, the talent isn't there. So I think while the method might be overall better or positive, the end result doesn't take advantage of that capability. And I think a lot of comics, and I think there's one other factor: the writer of the comic is more likely to do decompressed storytelling, where they're letting the artist carry a lot of the action, but the action isn't action. It's things like, hey, let's do a page showing the whole getting ready for the day, and walking outside of the apartment and kind of wandering up the street, where in years past that might have been one panel of the Hulk walking, and the little dialogue box says, after brushing his teeth and putting on his pants, the Hulk went out in search of action. And you didn't need to draw that out. Now, if you're a fan of movies, or you like that kind of storytelling, then you may want to see the Hulk doing all those things rather than just being told it in a dialogue box. And I gave you a very boring example. But the problem is, you could basically use a page to do what was done in a tiny dialogue box. And so that's a page gets taken away from action or moving the story along or something, something bigger that could happen. And so you wind up getting stories that feel very kind of simultaneously very decompressed, but also read very fast. Another, truth, and you may like it or not like it, it's up to personal opinion, is that comics from the 70s and the 80s took a lot longer to read because there was more to read. It's kind of one of the humorous aspects about, Bendis. Bendis 10 years ago would write these, like, just, it was a meme, or not meme, but you'd see these panels. I posted some myself of like the art being squeezed out by 8,000, word bubbles, because Bendis is literally having the person monologue every freaking thing that's going on. That, combined with decompressed storylines, meant that you got very talky comics. but they still read fast. As a reader, even though you had a lot of text to read, they still read very quick, and they still felt like you weren't getting a lot in that comic. It was like the equivalent of like popcorn. It didn't fill you up. It didn't do anything. Um, so I enjoyed comics that you would open it up and it would take a long time to read. If you look at Grunwald's run from Captain America, and in particular you look at like the Bloodstone Hunt or stuff like that, you get a lot of action taking place in each comic. It feels like each comic is a journey where a lot took place. But a lot of that was only possible because of the dialogue boxes and because of the thought bubbles and because they were able to kind of move action around by telling you rather than showing you. So I like the way though, to the person who wrote this in, I really like the way you framed that out because I like art. I think comics are a visual medium and I do like to be shown, not told things. But um, we arguably we have a lot more of that today, but because the artists do not take advantage of it, because the writers are kind of doing less with the page, I think the combination is actually worse in my mind. Um, I don't, I was never a big fan or a big hater of the thought bubbles. People have been religious about this in comics. They either love it or hate it. To me, it's a storytelling vehicle. If it works, it works. For some reason, they feel old fashioned and they're out of style now. So you don't see a lot of them, but I think they definitely have their place, and I think they can serve a good purpose. Um, I don't know. It's hard because there's a lot of comics I really really enjoyed and still enjoy, and they are filled with thought bubbles and all that kind of stuff, and I think they read great. The Burn run on Fantastic Four, like I've talked about before, a great run. There you have a really top-notch artist who's, drawing his heart out on the page, and you have thought bubbles, and you have a lot of, dialogue boxes, and it works. I think the combination is actually pretty brilliant. I'd hold that up against, any modern Fantastic Four run, including Hickman's, by the way. Um, I said I'd get back to it later. One aspect we do see, pretty much no thought bubbles. Um, you have a lot less, dialogue boxes, except you have a sharp increase in the editor doing stupid ass jokes in the narration box. And to me, if that all went away tomorrow, that would be amazing. I absolutely hate with an undying passion. Like Kelly Thompson does this a lot. Here's the Hulk, loves green, sometimes gets mad, purple pants. And it's like, oh, geez, shut the fuck up. I hate it so much. That kind of stuff. The cutesy jokes through narration boxes. Nick Lowe does a lot of this as well in his books. And to me, nothing jerks you out of the action. The artist can be putting up pretty amazing things on the page. And the second you start doing that crap in the dialogue boxes, it is like a record scratch of halting all the action in the comics. And I think that's definitely worse. But I would love to see some modern storytellers, like how it'd be a crazy idea, but Marvel has done the Nuff Said issues where you had a whole comic and there was actually no dialogue; it was all told through art. Those are pretty cool. Now, by the way, they also read faster. That was one of the complaints when Marvel would do this, and they've done it a few times in their run. Um, I would have readers come in that I was, obviously a child for the first time they did this, but the second time, I had a shop, and I remember people coming in going, "There wasn't any comic in this comic." It was all just pictures, and it flowed too quickly, which was funny because I mean it was a great story in a lot of cases, and I love that kind of every now and then break where you just got to tell a visual story. You're hearing the beep there. It's my car telling me I'm getting too close to something when I'm parking. Imminent death. Anyway, but that's an example of how you see the story flow and how you see it change. I like the idea of every now and then throwing out an issue like that for a change and stuff. But I would love to see a modern writer, like take a Jed McKay or a Al Ewing or a Scott Snyder, and say you're going to do a comic with thought bubbles. Or you're going to do it differently. This is stretching you. Let's see what that looks like when you bring back that kind of storytelling, and how would it play today? I'd be interested to see it. I don't know. To me, I really appreciate the mail. I think there's a happy marriage in here between how you basically the writer can write, the writer can remove some, use narration boxes to move the action along in places where they don't have to show you every scene that frankly aren't that interesting. The artist can be trusted to kind of actually do expressive pages again. I don't know. It feels like to me that the death of the narrative, the narration box, and the thought bubbles led to more panels where nothing is really going on, or the artist is copying and pasting things for dramatic effect, for the character just kind of standing there, showing time passing behind them or something. And I think that's to the detriment of the story for me. But what about you? What kind of comics do you like? What kind of storytelling do you enjoy? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for the mail. Really appreciate that one. And thanks for listening.